If you want to study innovation in a company that makes microchips or semiconductors, the cycle for innovation is long. Like going from an idea to like a plan for a semiconductor to actually producing a prototype chip to launching it can be years.
Professor Vaughn Tan is a strategy consultant, advisor, and researcher who graduated from Harvard with a PhD in organizational behavior. He currently leads Southeast Asia Executive Education for the University College of London. In his previous life, he was in a product management group for Google, where he was the product marketing manager for Google AdWords, Google Earth, and Google Maps. He also became the product manager for special projects focusing on genomics, structured data, and space exploration. Right now as we speak, the US is experiencing the Liberation Week. Donald Trump introduced a slew of tariffs for all their trading partners. And there is a sense that he has injected a lot of uncertainty into the global economy. But at the same time, a lot of people are saying that, this is very risky as well. And part of my question that kind of bubbled up as I was looking at this behavior was, there seems to be a difference between uncertainty and risk. What do you think is the difference?
So there absolutely is a difference between uncertainty and risk. It's just we tend to use the two words almost interchangeably, right? So whenever there's an unknown, usually in the future, we think of it as, we don't know what's going to happen. But the words we use to refer to it often are either uncertainty or risk, and we use them more or less as if they mean the same thing. But when we use the word risk, we often think, how do we manage this thing that we don't know that is risky? Then we turn to things like risk management. We do cost-benefit analyses. We do expected value calculations to decide what to do. And the problem is risk and uncertainty are actually two different things, right? In a situation of risk, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you know almost everything that you need to know about all the possibilities. You know all the possible actions you can take. You know all the possible outcomes that might result. You know precisely and accurately the connection between an action you take and an outcome that might result. And as a result, you can do things like cost-benefit analysis and expected value analysis. Now, you point out that Liberation Week is here, and there are all these things that are unknowns. But if you ask yourself, do you know all the possible things that Trump could be doing? No. Do you know all the possible outcomes that might result from things like a tariff war? No. Do you know the probabilities accurately and precisely that connect an action that, for example, the US takes and an outcome that might result, like what kind of tariff war there might be? You also don't know. And all the different outcomes that you also don't know about, you also don't know how much you value them. That's not a risky situation. You almost don't know anything about what's going to happen, right? And so that's what I would think of as true uncertainty. And in fact, that's the idea that risk is something that you can quantify with precision and with accuracy. And uncertainty is something that you cannot quantify, that you don't know enough about to quantify. That's not a novel idea. So the economist Frank Knight came up with this idea a long time ago, and lots of people know about it, and yet people still use these two words interchangeably in a way that is extremely conceptually loose and actually makes thinking about uncertainty and risk very fraught, very difficult, and usually not done very well. So the too long didn't read version is, in a situation of risk, you know almost everything there is to know about what you don't know. And in a situation of uncertainty, you don't. And you should not mix the two up because the two of them are actually fundamentally different things, as we've just talked about in relation to tariffs.
What's the cost of mixing it up?
If you assume that an actually uncertain situation is just risky, and then you apply risk management techniques to making decisions in that situation, you might actually, I would say you frequently make the wrong decision. So I'll give you an example. Remember back in February 2020, this was very early on in COVID, right? So big cities in China had shut down. We're already beginning to see that there's like this weird disease. We don't know how it's spread. We don't know how fatal it is. We actually don't even know like how likely it is that you get it if you're exposed to it. And we don't know who's been exposed to it. In that situation, if you recall, sometime in I think maybe the middle of February 2020, the World Health Organization comes out and it says, we're actually going to recommend against any kind of travel or trade restriction. And the reason for that pronouncement was that they had done a rigorous cost-benefit analysis about the cost of doing any kind of travel or trade restriction against the benefits of it. And how do you do a rigorous cost-benefit analysis if you don't know almost anything about what the disease is, how it spreads, how quickly it spreads, and where it's coming from and what it is? You can't. So as it turns out, the decision they made, like not even to say, maybe it's a good idea to pause travel for maybe a few weeks just to figure out what's going on. That obviously led to, a world that we all lived in. Like we lived in this world where there were very, very long shutdowns because the disease spread very, very fast before we knew how to deal with it. So the consequences of making a decision as if a situation is risky when the situation is actually uncertain are that you make the wrong decision. Right? And there's lots and lots of other examples like, banks and financial institutions that assume that complex derivatives are actually predictable and understandable until they realize very, very late in the game in 2008 that you cannot actually predict what's going to happen with these because they're just too complicated and interconnected. That's another example.
Then in that case, how should one think about uncertainty?
So in a situation of risk, what you're trying to do is you're really trying to optimize, right? You know so much about the things that you don't know that you can figure out, if I take this action, that outcome has this probability of occurring and I value that outcome in this way. That means that you can optimize. You can choose the probably correct action in a very sort of like comfortable, predictable sense. If you're in a situation of uncertainty, I think you can't do that. You have to fundamentally rethink the way you deal with the unknown. One of the ways is you take smaller bets and take more of them. Another way is you think about learning over time what the situation looks like. Because in a situation of risk, what you tend to do is you tend to figure out what the right approach is, then take a big bet, right? Because probably the bet's going to be right. In a situation of uncertainty, you don't know that. And so you can't take a big bet. Like what if you take a big bet, like the World Health Organization did on recommending against any kind of travel or trade restriction, and it turns out it's wrong.
Yep.
Right? Then obviously the consequences of one big wrong bet are very big. I think we need to have a fundamentally different way of thinking about it. It's not about optimizing singular monolithic action. It's about taking lots and lots of well-designed, informative actions that are like little experiments with learning what to do so that you figure out what the parameters are of the uncertainty that you're facing.
Yeah. So if you were in the World Health Organization back then, you would probably say, we should try to pause, like what you said just now, take a few weeks off.
Yes, take a few weeks off will be very disruptive and there will be costs of doing that. But if you're in a situation where, let's just be real, like an entire very, very big Chinese city had shut down completely before they decided to say, we are recommending you not to restrict travel or trade. I don't know whether now with hindsight, you would say, yeah, maybe we should have at least shut down travel for a couple of weeks just to see what's going on, see whether there's more stuff that happens that will update our prior, if you will. I would have said, maybe experiment with smaller things that will have a cost, but don't have as much of a cost as some really big pronouncement. Like you're not saying shut down travel and trade for 3 years, even though actually that almost happened. You're saying shut it down for a couple of weeks. At the end of a couple of weeks, let's review and see, right? Let's try other things, maybe smaller things. And if those small things appear to work or give us more information, that's a good way to approach this thing, which is uncertain, not risky.
Yeah. You remind me of the analogy that back then the Ministry of the Task Force used, which was the circuit breaker. I don't know whether it's the right analogy,
right?
But the frame of thinking of small adjusted bets, using that decision to update the current information model that you have.
Yes, for sure. And the thing is, in reality, this is how humans learn, right? Like when you are growing up as a very small child, you are not taking a single bet on a single sort of method of learning because you're not even thinking about that. You're just in the world doing your thing and you're experiencing stuff. And the stuff you experience updates some internal model that you have about what the world looks like and how you act inside it. This is how humans learn. Like, I don't know why we aren't thinking about applying something which is such a natural part of how we understand the world, how we update our assumptions about the world, to a world that is clearly something which is not risky, but instead is increasingly uncertain.
But it seems like the world today likes to shun uncertainty. I think the more, for example, like the more mathematical your financial model is, the more you feel like, you're more certain about things.
Yes.
And there is this inclination that with more tech, we can escape uncertainty.
Yeah.
But you probably argue that uncertainty is crucial, then in that case, why is uncertainty actually important? Why should we learn to embrace it?
I think so. There's two parts of this answer, if you will, right? So one of them is there's a reason why it's so tempting to try and say that everything is modelable, predictable, optimizable, because that's comfortable, right? Like one of the things that I suspect is true is that we are evolutionarily opposed to the idea of not knowing what's going to happen. We actually, from a physiological perspective, like there's a stress reaction, right? So you feel stressed out, you feel a bit frantic when you confront something, no matter what it is, that's unknown. So we don't like it. And we don't like it not just cognitively, we also don't like it in an affective sense. Like you just feel bad when you're facing something which is uncertain. So I think that's part of the reason why it happens. And the reason why that is, I mean, presumably back in evolutionary time, if you were entering into an uncertain situation, it was actually existential, right? Like you're walking, from, I don't know, like someplace to your cave, and you can either take the path that you know very well, you know where all the animals live and all that, or you can take the shortcut through the very dark forest where who knows what's there, who knows what animal wants to eat you that's inside, or what other tribe maybe doesn't like you, wants to kill you, who knows. You don't go into that kind of uncertainty because it's existential. But nowadays, the kinds of uncertainty that we face usually are not like that. So our evolutionary instinct to be incredibly stressed out by uncertainty no longer are adaptive to us. So that's one thing. So we should probably change the way we think about the uncertain, because the uncertain has a different implication for us. What is that different implication? I think it's that if we want to do anything that's new, by definition, there is no option other than to do something which is uncertain, right? If you think about it, risk, formally defined, is when you know almost everything there is to know about what you don't know, right? You don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you know all the actions, all the outcomes, all the causal mechanisms, and you know them precisely. In that situation, you are never doing any true innovation because you already know what's going to happen. The only time you have true innovation is when someone does something that usually people say, that's not going to work, right? Or even if it works, nobody's going to want it. And we've lots and lots of examples about this. Like the best example that everyone probably knows about is the iPhone, right? So first people said, nah, you can't do this weird like interface. Nobody's going to understand how to use it. And then when it finally came out, people said, actually many people in the phone industry and the computer industry said, nobody's going to want this thing. And then, it was only released in 2007, the first iPhone. Less than 20 years later, everybody's using a smartphone, right? So the innovation was not only like a hardware innovation, it was an innovation in the understanding, I suppose, of what people want. What do consumers want? If there is not that uncertainty, there is no possibility of doing something new that addresses this new demand that shows up.
Yeah.
And you actually see that again and again in every single kind of innovation that exists. The only way new things happen is if you're in a, not risky, you're in an uncertain situation about what kinds of actions are possible, what kinds of outcomes might result, what kind of causation is possible, and also what things people value.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why it's important, right? Like not only is it no longer adaptive for us to treat all unknowns as something which is uncomfortable, that we think of as being optimizable, comfortable, risky. It's also that if we care about doing new things because new things help us adapt to the increasingly weird world that we live in, we really need to be able to understand that there is uncertainty. Uncertainty is essential. Uncertainty is something that we need in order to do anything that's new. That's why.
It reminded me of the classic Henry Ford phrase, right? Which is that if you ask the consumer what they want, they'll just ask for a faster horse, so you'll never get a car. And in a sense, that kind of frames the way we should think about uncertainty, which is that to think of a future which is different from ours, to kind of embrace that uncertainty, then that's the only way you can get any form of innovation going.
I'd actually never heard of that phrase from Henry Ford before, but it makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you're trying to do something, generally what you're trying to figure out is how do you get as much certainty as you can that the thing you're trying to do is the right thing, which is fine if what you're trying to do already exists in the world and you're just trying to figure out like, should you be doing it or not? But if you're trying to do something brand new, where would you go to find out whether or not the brand new thing actually works? It doesn't exist yet, right? And so I think that's a really crucial insight. You cannot do anything really new and figure out whether or not it's right to do that by going out and looking in the world and asking people if they want that thing. That is also, by the way, that last kind of uncertainty that nobody really talks about, but I think is very important, which is the outcome that you're imagining. If it doesn't exist yet, very few people can think about whether or not it's valuable, right? So before women had the vote, the default position was that women were not citizens who were valuable enough, in a sense. And by the way, I disagree with this point of view. I'm just describing what it was before. Before women had the vote, people didn't think that women should have a vote. So if you ask them whether women should have a vote, a very small number of people would say yes. And in fact, when there were all these women's suffrage movements in the US and the EU, in Europe, I suppose, there were lots of protests against the possibility of women's suffrage. And now, if you ask people whether women should have the vote, the answer is obviously yes, because our value systems, what kinds of outcomes we value, those things change too. There's uncertainty about them, and that's what creates the possibility for something which is different about what's valuable. Right? I think it's a really important thing for us to have.
When people think about innovation, they think about the iconic brands like your Apple, your Teslas of the world, that you previously cited. But they don't think of like high-end cuisine, which is something that you spend like years working on to figure out why high-end cuisine requires innovation. I'm curious, why do you start with high-end cuisine as a place to study from?
Well, the honest answer is it's more fun than studying microchip foundries or cars. But there is also like a technical answer, right? Like if you want to study innovation in a company that makes microchips or semiconductors, the cycle for innovation is long. Like going from an idea to like a plan for a semiconductor to actually producing a prototype chip to launching it can be years. And so if what you're trying to understand is what kinds of group process, what kinds of structures, what kinds of things people do, make it possible for people to ask questions which have never been asked before and answer them well, and that's the innovation problem. Do you want to study things that have a very long cycle time? Or do you want to study things that can happen in like a couple of hours, a couple of days, right? Because your own time as a researcher is limited. If you study a thing that takes 2 or 3 years for a full cycle of innovation to complete, you only have one thing if you spend 2 or 3 years watching it. If on the other hand, you study a bunch of cooks, and what they're trying to do is come up with a new idea in food, or a new way to use an ingredient, or a new way to combine ingredients on a plate, or a new story to tell about a plate or a bunch of plates. Some of that stuff happens in a few hours. Some of it happens in a few days. If you spend 6 to 8 weeks with them, you can see, 40, 50, 60 cycles, and you can start to see patterns, right? So that's what I tell people, which is also true. But the reality is it's also more fun. Yeah. So that's why I think it's a useful thing to look in unusual places that are informative about phenomena that you care about. Right? Innovation is one of those things. Like there's innovation happening in all sorts of places. And the fact that we only look at the obvious, legible places like big tech companies, I think gives us a very warped idea of what innovation is and how it's done. And so looking elsewhere gives you other points of view that are, they generate alpha, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. When I was looking at the case studies that you highlighted, there were many that kind of showcase the kind of the uncertain environment that a lot of these restaurants operated in, and B, the kind of ingenuity that you need to kind of develop either a product or process innovation. Were there kind of any examples that stood out to you particularly that changed the way you think about innovation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's maybe 2 things that were most interesting, right? So one thing was this idea that, usually if you've ever done any hiring, so I used to be on the hiring committee when I was at Google. And one of the things that I saw was you would always have a, detailed sort of requisition for the person that says what you expect them to do. And the way you hire people is you look at this sort of scope of work for the person, and you recruit people who seem like they're a good fit for that. And then when you're interviewing, really what you're trying to figure out is, are they as good a fit as they look on paper? And when you choose the person that you hire, you're hiring for the best fit to this requisition, this scope of work. That idea has made sense to people in HR, in companies for decades, because this is the default for how you hire. But if you ask yourself, okay, if I'm doing innovation work and I don't know what the work will have to be in advance, how do you write a scope of work? You can't, right? Like you write a scope of work, and the moment you write it, it's out of date. If you use that to hire people for innovation, you are selecting people against this requisition that is already out of date the moment you wrote it. By the time you hire them in 2 weeks, if you're lucky, but in most cases, it's more like 3 months, it's very out of date. Even if it was not out of date on the day you hire them, by the time they're in the company for like 3 or 6 months, it's out of date even more. This way of hiring people, that is what almost every company does. The research that I was doing showed me it made no sense at all, because what these R&D chefs were doing in their companies was that they weren't really being hired against the scope of work at all. They were being hired against this idea that there are some things that we know you absolutely have to know how to do, but it's a very small part of your actual work. So let's assume that maybe 30 or 40% of your work is stuff you must know. You have to know how to, in the chef's case, like how do you clarify a stock, right? That kind of thing, which every sort of junior chef eventually learns how to do. That's a baseline. But on top of that, we don't know what you have to do. Most of what you have to do, you have to figure out, and you have to figure out with us. You have to try things out. You have to figure out what we need that we don't even know about. You have to show by trying it out that you understand what we need. And you have to prove it to us, right? You have to do the thing that you say you can do and show it to us. And if we think it's good and you like to do it, then that becomes part of what you do. So that turned into this idea of open-ended roles that you go into, that you shape through a process of negotiated joining. And it turns out that way of hiring people, nobody really does it in conventional business, even though if you're trying to run an innovation company or a company that makes new products, you really should have something like that working. And if you do it, in the few companies that I've worked with to help them redesign their hiring process, if you do it, it dramatically changes the efficacy with which you hire people in innovation capacities. Also, by the way, innovation capacities are one of the type of function in a company where you do uncertainty work a lot. But really all leadership roles in companies are like that too, right? As long as the business environment or the operating environment is changing unpredictably and frequently, you have to do things which you weren't expecting. Your job role changes all the time. You should be hiring with negotiated joining into open-ended roles, for sure. The other insight from looking at these R&D chefs that were really interesting, and the most interesting thing about them was they were very, very good at doing things where they didn't know how to do them and they might fail. So I don't know about you, but I'm terrible at doing things I don't know how to do. Like I hate the prospect of failing. It is an active effort to get over that hump. But a lot of the people that I was interviewing and working with in these R&D kitchens were actually like, they didn't like failing, but they were very okay with doing things where they might fail, right? They were very okay with being uncomfortable in doing something and with the discomfort that comes from not knowing what you have to do and how to do it yet. And that seems to me, after now looking at those chefs, as well as I work with startups, I look at small business founders, that single characteristic, the ability to be uncomfortable but still productive, the ability to see that discomfort that comes from uncertainty is something that you cannot just avoid or get rid of, but you have to embrace and learn how to deal with. That's something which is a big differentiator, right? And that's something which I find also is lacking in a lot of corporations, a lot of public institutions as well.
What about the environment that allows them to be uncomfortable yet productive?
I think it's less about the environment. It's more about what they have chosen to do themselves to learn how to deal with the physical sensation of discomfort. So you remember early on I said we've got this probably evolutionarily evolved stress reaction when we face uncertainty, right? So when you face the unknown, usually what happens is your stress hormones rise, cortisol, adrenaline. It gives you a physical sensation, which is probably a legit thing. Like if you are in a fight or flight scenario, you want the stress hormones, the adrenaline to all be coming out so that you can act very fast. But do you want that to be the thing that stops you from doing something that creates that kind of stressful situation, when the thing that creates a stressful situation might help you learn how to do something new, might help you create a new product? No, you don't, right? So what you need to do as a person who is trying to learn how to be productively uncomfortable is you need to learn how to tame that really very bodily response. And the thing that they were doing was they were practicing, right? So I don't know whether you have, one example of a system that many people do that is very similar to this is progressive overload in resistance training. Like if you are lifting weights and you've never lifted any weights before, you do not immediately do, say, a chest press with 80 kilos of weight loaded. You just don't, right? What you do is you do what you can. Once you've got to the point where you can lift, say, 15 kilos, you overload slightly and you build capacity. Then you rest for the capacity to build up. Then you overload again and again and again. Dealing with productive discomfort means learning to deal with discomfort means learning how to do that kind of progressive overloading with your exposure to uncomfortable situations that help you to learn. So what they were doing is they were frequently putting themselves by design into situations that were uncomfortable, but where if they managed to get through the discomfort, they learned how to do something new. So a lot of the people that were in the book come from very weird backgrounds, and then they enter into cooking because they were interested in it. And if you come from, say, I don't know, biochemistry research and you want to enter a professional kitchen, it's actually very uncomfortable, right? Everyone knows how to do what they do in kitchens. They know how to be in a kitchen. There's a lot of tacit stuff nobody teaches you. And you come in with this other body of knowledge, which is valuable, but you don't know how to be there. It's very uncomfortable, right? It's a bit like going to, I don't know, like going from one school to another school. You don't know the language. You don't know who the cool kids are. It's very uncomfortable. But if you do it and you manage to like make new friends or whatever, you have more experience than anyone in that new place. And this is actually what was going on with all these people as well. So they were doing that kind of thing all the time. They were learning how to be uncomfortable by being progressively more and more uncomfortable, and by designing their discomfort so that it was more likely to result in learning and wasn't just random stuff.
There is this idea of design that you also talk about, which is like desperation by design,
Yes.
in which like the leader of sorts, they kind of throw the team into something beyond more than they can handle.
I would sort of zoom out from the culinary context and then
Yeah.
just think about the sort of the general principle, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the things, and again, this is about comfort as well. You know the idea of a comfort zone?
Yep.
It's like, it's a zone in which everything that you do, you know how to do them with reliability, and you understand the resources that you need, and also the processes for working with each other inside that zone. People understand. It's easy to do it. The problem with that kind of comfort zone situation is there's no growth, right? You may become more and more efficient, but you don't necessarily rethink what it means to be effective in that kind of comfort zone. The only time you learn as a team is when you push outside the comfort zone. Like when you are asked to do something that you don't know how to do yet, which is difficult to do. If you push too far, the team breaks down, right? So here's a team that is designed to, for example, run a restaurant. They're very good at running a restaurant. Now, what you ask them to do is you ask them to run a conference for, frontier thinkers in food systems. They've never done anything like that before. There is a possibility that it requires skills that they don't have, that they cannot acquire in time. It causes the team to break down. But if it doesn't, what it does is it forces the team to learn how to do something brand new for them.
Yep.
It forces them, for example, to absorb information and people that they don't have now because they realize they need some skill and it's only there. So we now have to learn how to incorporate this person's skill inside, this person from outside. It forces them to learn how to do different things with each other, right? So I used to be a sous chef. I know how to cook and I know how to pass my dish off to the sauce guy to sauce it, and then to the pass to like plate it up and garnish and then send out. But now I also need to learn how to talk to not only a famous chef, but also a famous food agroecologist. I don't know how to do that, but I got to learn, right? So that kind of learning, that kind of change of process, and also the idea that it's okay to not know what to do. These are the three sets of things that pushing people beyond the comfort zone, putting them into a situation of discomfort and maybe even desperation. That's what the value of doing that is. And the reason why you need to push into desperation is because whenever people feel like everything is going to be okay, they never work as hard and they're not willing to let go of the things that are comfortable. And that prevents the learning, right? So if you're not in the discomfort, desperation phase, you're not willing to do whatever it takes to get past that phase. And again, you see this, if you look at a team that has been put into a desperation by design situation, what you find is at first, they're just like annoyed that they're doing this thing they don't know how to do. At some point, they realize to get it done, things must change. And then at that point, that becomes desperation. And the desperation is what causes the model of like transformation or organizational change, where you have to take a frozen organizational structure, you have to unfreeze it, change it, and then refreeze it. This is John Cotter. That idea that you unfreeze, usually it takes a lot of work, but unfreezing sometimes can just be because you created a desperation event that was calibrated to not break them down, but just enough to unfreeze the situation so that they can change stuff inside before they refreeze again.
Yeah.
So the desperation is a crucial part of it.
How does one begin to think about unfreezing or begin that desperation projects? Obviously, you talk about the progressive overload.
Yes.
Of like starting with what you think they can handle and pushing them slightly beyond.
The thinking process behind Desperation by Design is not just to assign a task that the team doesn't know how to do, right? Because that's something, by the way, which a lot of leaders will do, right? They'll say, oh, stretch goals, and we'll assign a stretch goal, and there's no way we understand how the team can do it yet. That often leads to serious overload, team collapses, relationships break down, that kind of thing. I would say that Desperation by Design is actually a much more carefully managed process. There are a few things that you need to do. One of them is you need to make sure that there is external commitment to the goal that causes Desperation by Design. So it can't just be some kind of fake thing. Like, don't just do this thing for show. There has to actually be a business consequence for doing it. So for example, a lot of people will create a task for a team to learn how to do something new, but the result of that task never becomes part of business process, doesn't become a product that gets sold. If you don't have a real task, the people who are doing the task don't commit. If you have a real task, but it's not in some way committed to either people outside the team or to actual customers, there's also no accountability. So you can't just say, oh, let's do this thing which is real, but we're not going to tell anyone about it. Because if we don't tell anyone about it and we fail, that's okay. The moment you tell someone outside that you trust or you respect that you're going to do this thing, then you are committed to doing it, and that pushes you into desperation as well, potentially. But maybe the most important thing that you have to do with Desperation by Design, two most important things. One of them is, as the leader, you have to have a very, very close connection to the affective state of your team, right? When you propose something which pushes the team beyond its comfort zone, the reactions that you get that are non-cognitive, there are stress reactions, there are affective reactions, they are what tell you whether or not you're pushing the team too far or not. Because when you are a leader that works with your team frequently and consistently, you start to understand when they react and when they overreact, and you start to be able to calibrate whether or not you're pushing them a bit too far. So that's one. But the other thing that is also really important is, like with resistance training, you have to give people time to rest, right? So doing something which is Desperation by Design is very, very hard. It takes a lot of energy. That is not just like, I have to run around a lot. It's also cognitive, emotional energy that you have to rethink how you do things. You have to change something that you felt very comfortable with. That's stressful and emotionally hard. You have to give people time to rest after that. And if you do, then what they do is there's kind of like almost like a muscle for dealing with discomfort. If you build that muscle by doing something which is desperate, uncomfortable, and then you give time for that muscle to rebuild up, the next time you do something which is beyond their capacity, the new thing will be more beyond their capacity than the first thing. So you're gradually seeing a build-up of capacity if you do those 4 things.
The 3 points that you made about it being something that's tied to a real outcome that has some sort of accountability mechanism, and having that effective relationship between the leader and the team, actually that is really kind of illustrated very clearly in your restaurants and your high-end restaurants that you talked about in the book. Because at the end of the day, when you're doing that product innovation or process innovation, it leads to maybe the better like entree or a better main course for the patron. Were there any favorite examples that you saw kind of this Desperation by Design fully fleshed out for you?
I mean, the best example and the one that's in the book is, so there's a restaurant in Copenhagen called Noma. For a while, I mean, it's still actually very famous, but it became most prominent. I mean, it reached its like sort of like early peak of prominence around the time when I was joining them, right? Like I was hanging around in the kitchens a lot. And they were a restaurant that was very good at sort of telling a story about where they're located in Copenhagen, Arctic Circle cuisine, cooking and eating food using techniques and ingredients that are from very close to where they are. So that's what they did for 10 years, got famous doing it. And then one year, 2011, the guy who runs it, Rene Redzepi, he decided not only should we be a good restaurant, we should also help the food industry rethink what it means to do food well. And what this means is, he wanted to run a conference, bring people together, share ideas. And his restaurant doesn't do that. None of his team actually had ever done a conference before, but he decided to do it and to do it in 3 months, I think. I think he came up with the idea in June. The conference was in like September, something like that. And that was the first example I saw of, okay, we don't know how to do this at all, but the leadership team has decided and consulted with us, obviously, we should do it. We don't know how to do it, but maybe we'll try. And it was actually really quite desperate. They didn't know how to do stuff. They weren't sure whether they could get people to come, but they did it. And over time, the fact that they did it meant that every single one of this symposium was called MAD. The MAD symposium was the conference that they ran. Every single MAD symposium pushed further and further away from comfortable topics in the industry, right? So in the food industry, for a long time, there was a lot of drug use, mental health problems that nobody wanted to talk about. But one of the MADs eventually was able to talk. The whole thing was about these issues. So eventually, I suppose you start from this point where you do something which is uncomfortable, you've never done it before, and you're able to keep pushing the team that's doing it so that they're becoming more and more able, like they're climbing this ladder of being able to do uncomfortable things that they've never done before. And eventually what you get is they now have a school, right? So they've turned it from a conference that they've never organized before that's very small about new ideas that the food industry needs to talk about into a school that teaches people in the food industry about how to change the food system. So now they've got a MAD Academy, I think it's called, in Copenhagen. And all that started from doing something which is difficult, but doable, but causes desperation.
And in that sense, they demonstrated not just effectiveness, but also efficacy, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Ability to effect change.
Yes.
It brings me to a separate question about institutions and governments, which is that Singapore is one of the model nations that many countries look at today. They say, wow, it's very effectively run. There is also this idea that we were an innovator in many ways.
Yeah.
Even the way we started out, the kind of institutions that we built, the kind of philosophies we chose to adopt. We didn't kind of take the free market approach, but we didn't exactly embrace communism wholeheartedly. But at the same time, you've become so successful, you've become so effective, you've kind of frozen it in your own way. My question to you would then be, do you think Singapore has that trap, or Singapore might face that trap of becoming so effective that we kind of lose efficacy?
Yes, absolutely. So I think I don't know as much about Singapore history as I should, but I know a little bit about it because I grew up here, right? I think that we can interpret what happened in the 1960s until the 1980s, 90s as we're in a situation where things are actually pretty desperate, right? So it wasn't clear in the 1960s whether we would survive as an independent nation state. This is part of the narrative of our founding narrative, right? And so if you're in that situation, you're willing to do things which you wouldn't be willing to do if you're comfortable.
Yeah.
So we were willing, for example, to take actually pretty big singular bets that the first generation political leadership, they were all brilliant. I've now come to this position after, when I was younger, I was much more critical of the kind of so-called repressive regime that we have. I actually don't think it's that repressive at all. But the one thing that is definitely true about that first generation of political leadership is they knew that there were difficult choices to be made. The answers were not certain. Like the right answer, you don't know what the right answer is to the bet that you take, right? Should you be investing in upskilling your population, or should you try very hard to make a country that is able to deal with the regional dynamics rather than trying to absorb sort of influences from further away like we did? None of these questions, and a whole bunch of other infrastructure, economy questions, none of those questions had correct answers, and all of them were difficult decisions to make. That is the kind of strategy under uncertainty that I think is extremely important, that they did very well back then. But I think they were able to do that because it was very clear to everyone. They didn't have to say, Singapore's in a kind of a stressful situation that is a bit desperate. There's no certainty about whether we'll survive. That's why we have to commit to something and go ahead. They didn't have to convince the population that that was true, because it was very obvious that that was true. We're now many, many decades after that, and things are very comfortable, right? So you now need to convince the population, the electorate, that things are uncomfortable to be able to take more risks that may not seem like things that you should do because things are comfortable enough to not have to take those risks. And not all of the things that we're asking people to do are risky in the we know everything about what we don't know way. Many of the things that we should be trying to do are also uncertain, right? Like things that will help us learn whether there are possible things that we could do as a country or as people in the country that have never been done before or haven't been done here before that may be good things to do as well. So I think the dilemma we face is we are too comfortable, and it's very obvious that we're comfortable. And when you're comfortable and you're not used to being uncomfortable cognitively, emotionally, economically, you don't tend to do things that are different.
Mm.
That's probably a big problem for us.
So now I'd like to put you in a bit of a spot. So
Mm.
one of the through lines in your writing and your work is that you have this emphasis on education. So for example, in the restaurant, there's this learning by doing. The chefs are constantly learning things, and the way they embrace uncertainty is through learning. So learning definitely plays a huge role. And obviously in Singapore, education, or the Ministry of Education, is focused on, educating the young,
Yeah.
teaching the young to embrace or to work or operate in an uncertain world.
Yeah.
So if you had the ear of the Minister of Education today, and he asked you for advice and say, hey, it's clear that we're living in an uncertain world.
Yeah.
And I need your help to help me maybe revise the curriculum or help me shape the system better. What's that kind of advice you would give him?
Great question. One that's obviously very close to things I'm interested in. I think so. There's lots of things at the Ministry of Education. Like from my external view, you see that they're trying to do a lot of things, right? They're trying to teach critical thinking. They're trying to teach computational thinking. These what do they call them? 21st century competencies. That's a clear sort of place where there is efforts to do stuff like that. I think, just very frankly, whenever you have a system where almost all of your ability to do the things that you want ends up being pegged to something which is easily quantifiable, like a test score, that washes away all the other stuff, right? So one thing that we should probably do, although I can't see how it's possible given the infrastructure we've already built up, is we maybe need to create ways for people to do highly desirable things like getting into a top university in Singapore without focusing so much on the test score that you have. So some ways to do it that may not actually work here, but just ideas are have a pot, like a small population of people who could get in, not randomly, but just based on things that are not test scores, explicitly not test scores, right? I think we can maybe start to think more creatively about ways of encouraging people to think about demonstrating ways of being successful that aren't about conventional ideas of easily legible performance. Now, another thing that maybe we could do that is a bit more out there is to think about what we can do inside the pedagogical framework that we have to introduce people to uncomfortable ideas more. Because I don't think that's not an explicit objective of our education system, right? So I went all the way through to the end of JC in Singapore. And the way we frame learning for the most part, or at least it was true when I was going through these, was there are correct answers, right? The correct answers are in a framework that you get tested on. The arbiters of correctness are teachers. And the only reason why I didn't fully believe that along the way was I had amazing teachers, like all the way through from primary school. I can identify specific teachers along the way who all said, this is not the right way to think about it, right? So in reality, there are some facts, but interpretations of facts, interpretations of what things you value, there's diversity of those things. That means that correct answers can only generally be about facts. They can't really be about interpretations. Interpretations have to be argued into existence. You have to be able to justify those things. I think that if we had an education system that was better at teaching people to do that kind of uncomfortable consideration of whether or not you believe something, why do you believe something? In philosophy, you would call this like epistemic reasoning. That would be a good thing for us to do. We should never call it epistemic reasoning or epistemology in schools because that will turn people off, but we should be teaching them to say, okay, if we say this thing, for example, we provide an interpretation of why Singapore became independent in 1965. Do you believe it? Where is the data coming from? Do you believe this data? Is there missing data that would give us a different interpretation of it? That's just for history. You can do this for almost every subject. And if we taught that instead of teaching people to remember facts and then regurgitate them in exams, which I know they're not trying to do, but that's just how it works. But if we explicitly say, okay, let's not do this, let's do it this other way instead, maybe we would get a little bit further. I think also to the point of sort of progressive overload, having other ways for people to be exposed to uncomfortable things is probably a good thing. How that looks for different age groups will look very different, right? So for adults, like, people of your age or my age who are, well-versed in living in the world, exposure to uncertainty can be something that you do as a game. Like, there's that thing up there which we can talk about if you want, but we often need prompts to force us to do something that is uncomfortable, but also designed to expose us to new ideas, new ways of thinking. And maybe we need to think about what those look like for younger children as well. That's something which I've been thinking about a little bit. I don't have answers yet, but it seems like an important thing to try and do, for sure.
It seems to me that, once we hit adult learning, there's almost like a reversion to credentialism, right? So some of the things that you talked about, like when we use exam as a way to test a child's or student's aptitude, and then like that washes away a lot of the other maybe more important but seemingly inconvenient things. It translates a lot into adulthood, because now when people think about adult learning when you're in the workforce, they talk about, we need to upgrade our skills, we need to stay relevant. The way people have that frame is, let me go and do some course, like a week, get a piece of paper, and then I can say, hey, I have a skill now.
Yeah.
Why is that the wrong way to think about learning? And maybe would there be a better alternative?
So it's not necessarily the wrong way. What I would say maybe instead is that of the ways that you can upgrade people or give them the ability to do more things if the things that they used to do have become less valuable, credentialing is probably one of the ways, but shouldn't be the only one. Right. So what credentialing does, like the traditional uses of education, network, if you go to a school, you meet people who are your peers, you learn how to hang out with them and do things with them, which is cool. Actual learning of content. And then of course there's a credential, right? It's a signaling mechanism. So the credentials nowadays, it seems like, especially for continuing education, because I also do some of that for UCL, the credential often does not seem to map very much to learning new ways of thinking. It does not often translate to changing the way they approach doing work. I would say that one thing that we could do to get away from credentialism in adult education, or in reskilling, if you will, is to change the way we hire so that we don't look so much at sort of the list of things that you have done on your CV that make us think that you are a good fit for our job scope, but instead to do something like negotiated joining on open-ended roles, right? So what is the way that you could implement this with people who are, late in career trying to change industry? You could say, okay, I can't hire you full-time yet, but what I want you to do is I want you to come in for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months on a pro rata full-time salary. And while you're here, you show me what you can do, right? You would probably have to do an interview, or not, 1 or 2 interviews maybe up front, to figure out whether or not they are people that you want to work with or you think that you might want to work with. But most of the learning about whether or not they can do the thing, and in fact, most of the learning from them about what thing they have to do, should come from being there actually doing the thing, rather than from a piece of paper that is your CV that has a bunch of lines on it. So the idea of negotiated joining and open-ended roles is really about not only helping an organization and a person who wants to join it figure out what they do in a situation where they're doing work where you can't program it in advance. It also can be about giving space for people who are changing careers late in life or even early in life to show that the things that they did in the other career that they had might be relevant here in ways that you as the employer don't even recognize. That to me seems like the more effective way, even though it looks inefficient and messy. It looks like the more effective way to give people opportunities to try new things late in life, instead of just giving them many, many incentives just to credential up.
What's the barrier, or what prevents companies from trying this? I assume the first one that comes to my mind is it just increases the friction, like what you say, and also like increases essentially the transaction cost of you joining the company, right?
Yes. one of the barriers is this idea that now it's harder, right? Generally, if you are hiring people, most of the heavy lifting of hiring goes through your HR talent organization. And they have best practices that were evolved from, a lot of business school research, a lot of looking at what other companies do. It appears frictionless, but if you ask anyone in an organization, what is the real cost to hiring people who are not a good fit? You've hired them, they know that they should stay in a company for like at least a year and a half, otherwise it looks bad on the CV. They stick around, they're not very productive. You want to get rid of them, but you can't really get rid of them. They want to leave, but they think it's not a good idea to leave. They act as a drag on the company. So there is a hidden friction to hiring the wrong way. And often credential-based hiring doesn't get you very good people, right? It gets you people who are good enough, but do they get you people who are really tailoring what they do to what you need based on what they have that you don't know that they have? All these conditional questions, they're not really doing that. So the first thing that I would say is, if you are a company and you're trying to hire like this, you may be overlooking the fact that your existing apparently low friction hiring process is actually very high friction, but in a place that is longer lasting and less obvious to you. Now, I think the other problem is most hiring is done by HR people, and most HR people go according to best practices that don't talk about this at all, right? And for that, I would say the way to think about it is, if you are an HR practitioner, right? You run HR in your company, or you run HR in a large organization, and you are hiring people. A good way to ask the question, how do I change this to be more effective, is look at the kind of work that you're hiring for. If you're hiring for work that is very programmatic, you understand how it needs to be done, you know exactly how to measure success, you should probably hire the conventional way. But for all the other kinds of things that you need to do, if it's anything to do with product innovation, if it's anything to do with doing something in an industry or economy where things are changing dramatically, and this doesn't have to be at very senior levels, it can be all the way through, right? Even a customer service person in a market where consumer demand is changing a lot, you can't expect them to be successful using a set script that's static. They have to be able to learn what customers want as that thing changes. If you're in a situation where you're hiring for this kind of uncertainty work, you should probably be hiring a different way. And I think the different way is by negotiation in open-ended roles. This is something which I know sounds messy, frictional, hard to do, but actually it's very easy and it's very low cost. All it does is it requires you to change the way you think about how you hire. And frankly, it's for the right person, the right potential hire. It's also a more fun way. You will automatically filter for the right people based on who is interested in doing something like this. Right? So it's much more effective in that sense.
Singapore has built itself up as maybe a financial hub, a high-end manufacturing hub. So the traditional pitch by maybe say an EDB officer would be that like Singapore is the gateway to Southeast Asia. With that, we have developed a whole range of startups, right, that kind of look at tackling the region. We're trying to scale up as fast as possible. With my question to you would then be, should we frame ourselves in a different way?
Up until now, the strategy that we've adopted is to try and bring companies that are large, that have an established business model, but want to have a Southeast Asian or Asian sort of location from which to operate. And so this is basically the function that EDB has, right? Go out and find potentially good companies to locate a head office for Asia in Singapore, or to locate R&D facilities or something in Singapore that's like a big sort of presence. I think our strategy for economic development has also been very subtly but very profoundly affected by this idea that we need to go big and we need to go with successful business models already. And I think this doesn't actually work for the Southeast Asian context. I'll say why. A lot of the kinds of companies that we look at as being successful, they tend to come from very large markets where it's possible to have a total addressable market that's very big, right? So the US is one market where, you've got 280 million people or something. You can build a very big company that reaches massive scale inside just the US alone. Same with China. To some extent, not the same in India. If you look at Southeast Asia, we look as if we've got countries that are very big, like Indonesia. But if you look at Indonesia is not one single country. It's got don't know how many languages. It's extremely geographically spread out. Southeast Asia is actually a region of very, very small, relatively speaking, markets. In the Southeast Asian context, trying to build companies from Singapore, like tech companies or any other kind of company that has some massive TAM, I think is a dream, right? It's a dream that will never become a reality because the market does not exist like that. Instead, what Singapore should be doing is something that East Asia has been doing for a long time. We build conglomerates that are composed of companies that are individually actually quite large, but they never have the kind of total addressable market that we're aiming for. They have markets that are big enough to deal with the size of the markets that they deal with. So the fact that we always aim to, in the sort of tech startup setting, Singapore has it's got a bunch of policies to encourage venture capital to come in to run venture capital type tech startups. Venture capital type tech startups, the economics always require enormous TAMs. You have to have a unicorn to pay off your portfolio. This is fundamentally incompatible with the world that we live in Southeast Asia, right? We should be, if the government were to be trying to encourage a tech ecosystem in Singapore to form, one of the things it could do is to encourage the size of tech startup that isn't something that a VC would ever fund, but would be something that, for example, a private equity firm would want to buy. Cash flow positive, very quickly, addressing existing needs in conventional industries, and intentionally aiming for a total addressable market that is of the right size, much smaller, for parts of Southeast Asia. Singapore is actually one of the smaller markets here, but if you're doing insurance or finance, you shouldn't be trying to build a unicorn-sized thing that is invested in by VCs in Singapore. You should be trying to build something that is cash flow positive, solving existing problems that, for example, the insurance business in Singapore needs to solve, and that becomes, therefore, a business that throws off cash that a private equity company might want to buy. It's a fundamentally different approach to thinking about what kinds of tech startups and more generally what kinds of companies we should be encouraging in Singapore. Smaller and much more oriented at solving existing problems rather than creating new markets and problems that don't exist yet, that you therefore need a lot of VC subsidy in order to build.
Yeah, you make a convincing case, but the VC might say, and because I've interviewed Magnus Grimeland, he founded Antler, and maybe his view is that it is possible because if you are able to maybe exploit the different comparative advantages of each region or each country, you can build something that can solve the problems across the board. And I think that's probably true, but the success rate or hit rate might be much lower than what you see in the US, which is why in the 2010s, we had a ton of money poured into VC funded startups. And by the end of the decade, we kind of looked at the results and it was like, oh, there wasn't that many that came out.
So I think Magnus's point, Magnus's point makes sense. It is possible, it's plausible that the competencies across or the needs across different markets in Southeast Asia, maybe you find some kind of correlations between them. But the reality is the VC game is already a game in which, I don't know, if you're lucky, for every 10 companies you fund, 9 of them don't work at all.
Yeah.
And one of them, if you're lucky, pays off the whole portfolio. If you reduce the odds even more, you have to ask yourself, is VC the correct conceptual model for capital allocation in Southeast Asia? And the answer for me is no, right? If you're super lucky or you're incredibly insightful and you are able to have even the same returns profile as traditional VC in China or in the US, fine. But even that model is clearly not working very well. So why would you try and do it here when there's a different model that might work much better?
I got 2 more questions for you. These are my closing questions that I try to ask everyone. The first question is, what book do you recommend that everyone read?
Sure.
And the second one is a piece of advice for someone coming out of school, entering the workforce.
The book that I recommend reading is quite strange. It's called Seeing is Forgetting the Name of the Thing One Sees. And it's about how you can continue to do things over your entire course of your career and do things very differently while still trying to do the same thing over time. Right? So it's an intellectual biography of an artist that I love, Robert Irwin, written by an amazing author called Lawrence Weschler. I won't say any more about that. That's a recommendation, a very strong recommendation. It looks really weird. There's no good reason why you should read it. But it's an amazing book. And a recommendation for people coming out of school, I guess, the earlier in your career you are, the more uncertain things you should try and do, because that is actually the time at which you have the least downside from doing something that fails. Yeah, I think everything I've said before kind of feeds into that, but that is absolutely what I would be saying. And it's very hard to see people. I mean, no, that's not true. There are some people who advocate for that, but more and more people should be advocating for that, and they should be doing it in schools. Like, schools should be telling people, do something weird while you're in school or just after school. Like, not just after, right? Just during school as well. Do something weird, because what's the downside? Right?
Yeah.
Don't do anything illegal, but do something weird. Right? Okay, anyway,
With that, thank you, Vaughn, for coming on.
thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you are watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications for whenever new episodes are out. If you're on Spotify or Apple, it would help us greatly if you could leave a 5-star review on those platforms. Once again, thank you for tuning in to the Front Row Podcast.